Well, good afternoon on this bitter day. Um, Today, we're going to deeply involve ourselves in the classical period, the climax of Greek civilization, indeed, the climax of the ancient world. We've been dealing with the ancient world and so on in Mesopotamia, Egypt, um, Bronze Age Greece, but this is the culminating point, you could say. It set the standard for the rest of the period of ancient times um, during the development of Western civilization. Now, I want to begin with another review question. Remember, basically, this week we're doing 3 more review questions, and this will end the review leading to the exam, which will be posted on UmLearn on the 22nd. Are there any questions about this? Good. So question 10. Athenian democracy was both direct and limited. Explain. So in answering this question, you want to start off with the Dark Age, the very beginnings of the full development of Greek civilization, which was a period from 1100 to 800. We see that the city-states emerge from this context of isolation. They're ruled by little kings, kinglets, small monarchies. Then this is superseded by the age of colonization, 800 to 600. And here it's a military aristocracy, which basically controls power between 800 and 600. We noted that during this period, as it goes on, population builds up, land shortage, class conflict, poverty, debt and debt slavery are characteristics. And there is ongoing class conflict during this period. And so it leads, an attempted resolution comes in the 7th and 6th centuries with the tyrants, who are strongmen like Trump, who try to control the class conflict. But then now we have a clear transition to democracy. This is how democracy starts. One of these tyrants, Solon, he surprises because he is an aristocrat, but he realizes that without the work of the peasantry and so on, the cooperation, it's impossible to rule Athens. So he institutes a land reform. He cancels people's debts. And to a certain extent, he redistributes power from the aristocracy to the people. Now, Solon, who was remembered for his virtue, his civic virtue, when asked to become a tyrant, a permanent tyrant, he refused. He stepped aside, which led, we're looking at the 590s here, right through the 6th century, there were other tyrants. But finally, in 510, Athens becomes a democracy. The last tyrant is chased away, and full democracy emerges. In terms of posing the question, I said, well, this is a direct but limited democracy. It has certain qualities that clearly differentiate it from the democracy, the representative democracy that we're used to. We know that it was a direct democracy. We have a parliament which is made up of elected representatives. But in Athens, a democracy, all the citizens actually participated in passing the laws and determining who the magistrates, who the chief military officers would be. The popular assembly in which all citizens had a right to sit, there could be as many as 40,000 people sitting in this popular assembly. They would debate all these questions, the new laws, and the who would be appointed to what to such and such a post. So it was the citizens. There was no representation. The sovereignty lay with the citizens sitting in the popular assembly. It was a direct democracy. However, this democracy was quite limited in a certain sense. Only citizens could participate, and the number of citizens was limited. That's the point. Women, slaves, foreigners, who constituted 3/4 of the population, were excluded from this democracy. The citizens, one of whose qualifications was that they served in the wars, they were in the Navy, or they were in the infantry, they bore arms, and that gave them the right to citizenship. But this was a limited number of people. Women, slaves, foreigners were excluded. And really, in a certain sense, one has to ask, well, how could 40,000 people make the decisions? It's incredible. So how could this be done? Well, there was a certain amount of leisure in the society because all the people excluded, and especially the slaves, whose numbers were growing and growing and growing, did most of the work. So people could come away from their ordinary tasks and sit in the popular assembly for a day or so and make these decisions. That's the answer to this question. Does anybody have any queries about what I just said? So that's the answer to question 10. Now, I want to go back to the narrative, start with the narrative. Well, let me begin the narrative by, I'm going to begin with we're partly going over some of the stuff that we've already gone over at the very beginning, because I want you to sort of plug in here. Athens is the best example we have of this transition from tyranny to democracy, but it was happening elsewhere as well. Commerce and trade were growing in the Greek world. There were many commercial city-states, and we do see that in the more economically developed of these city-states, many of them turned into democracies in the course of the 6th and 5th century BC. So Athens was not unique. I'm using it as an example because it was the greatest of these commercial centers. And to review, it was great because it had between 500,000 and 600,000 people by the 5th century. It was a great city because in the first place, surrounding it was the area surrounding it is known as Attica. This was one of the really large agricultural plains in mainland Greece. So they produced a fair amount of food that could support a large population living in a city, to begin with. And then, of course, by 600, Athens was a booming manufacturing and commercial center. It had sent out many colonies all over the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. It was trading with all of these and other Greek city-states, a very active trade. Its pottery industries, its silver mines, its production of olive oil, and many other artisan manufacturers made Athens by 500 a really booming a center of the Greek economy. And making up this population, as I've already indicated, were many people who were not citizens. There were the women, of course, and women were muted in Greek society. Of course, that's true of Jewish society as well. Women were suppressed. I've explained that goes with property and class society. And such was the case in Greece as well. But there were many foreigners who were attracted to the prosperity of Greece. There were the growing number of slaves. And in the countryside, there were, of course, the peasants, large numbers of peasants. Now, as a matter of fact, or to recollect, the class conflict really had been going on since the period from 800 on, and it showed little signs of abating until Solon comes along, as I have explained. And I don't need to go into Solon's reforms because I did this earlier. Then we see in the course of the 6th century more tyrannies, but gradually the democracy, the peasants and the artisans who are the citizens, they get more and more power. This is happening in other cities as well. Well, by 510, you have this democracy. And as I've explained, it's a direct democracy based on the popular assemblies, but it's limited because only these citizens, who are also soldiers, have the right to vote in the popular assembly. Everybody else is excluded. It's important at this point to mention slavery. Slavery is very important in the background to all of this. There is this paradox, as I think I mentioned last time, the great cultural achievements, the democracy, the fact that these citizens were able to carry on so many wars, all was made possible by the work of the slaves, of whom maybe the slaves made up 30% of the Athenian population. Along with the women and some foreigners, they carried on the economy. So the citizens were free to debate in the assembly. They were, some of them, a minority. Those interested in intellectual matters would philosophize in the marketplaces. And here we come to Socrates and so on. Remember, this intellectual life is only the activity of a small minority of the population. But the production of great works of art, including the temples, is made possible by these slaves. So the slaves are very important. Well, to sort of explicate where this slavery comes from, it really starts back in the period of the aristocracy, when there's so many wars between these city-states, and when at the conclusion of these wars, the losers in these wars, the city-states that lose, many, indeed most of the population might be killed, but the rest would be enslaved, and they would be sold in the slave markets. And over time, the Greek economy, from 800 down to 500, we could say, because of the incessant wars, the slave markets were full. And so people bought slaves and they did more and more of the work. Furthermore, as this so-called democracy, and of course it has a particular sense, it's obviously a limited democracy. I mean, we're talking about slavery. Formally, there exists this democracy, but it's on top of an increasingly slave economy, if you get my meaning. Well, this contradiction exists, and it's actually made worse by the fact that the peasants and the artisans are actually gaining political power, and the landlords can't oppress them as much as they did in the past. They're freer, their circumstances are better. So the upper classes who own more land than the peasants, and indeed even the farmers, they turn to slaves because the peasants are freer, they're not overexploited. So the peasants, the slaves become increasing the basis of the economy. And this is important in a double sense, and this is quite important in terms of understanding the dynamics of classical Greece, is that it's generally agreed the existence of so many slaves made possible for the citizens to conduct wars, to sit in the popular assembly, the institutional warfare, the democratic assemblies were both based on or facilitated by slavery. As one can argue, likewise, the development of a certain leisured intellectual life amongst certain elite groups in Greek society. So you have this extraordinary burst of creativity in Greece. I'll have a bit more to say about their philosophy and their art a little bit later, but it is all based on slavery. And the other aspect of this that needs underlining is because there were so many slaves to do the work. Now, the Greeks were very interested in science, and I can't go into it in great detail, but they have very considerable achievements. But this did not translate into important technological innovations. Technology is all about labor saving. And in this society, there was no sense that labor had to be saved. The slaves were available. So there were people who invented new machines. This did occur, and we have this scientist Archimedes who did produce a number of interesting machines, and he was only one of several dozen people who did this sort of thing. But their machines were never applied generally because most work was done by these slaves, and there was no need for, people thought, there was no need for technical devices. Why spend money on this? And so technology was arrested in Greek society. It never really developed its productive capacity. And the same thing is true of Roman society. There were even more slaves. And this is a fundamental weakness of classical civilization. Indeed, it has a lot to do with the ultimate demise of ancient civilization, the underlying slave exploitation, and the absence of machinery based on the institutionalized existence of slavery. So this is quite an important point. Now, by the end of the 6th century, that is to say, round about 510, 520, the leading cities, their economies, the most salient characteristic was that slaves did a disproportionate amount of the work. Now, I want to turn, let me, at this point, maybe I should show this. I'm trying to show a very brief, to give you some sense. I'm just showing this brief part of this because I wanted you to have some sense of what this looked like. Okay, we're seeing this here. I think this is certainly idealized, obviously, but nevertheless, um, it is impressive. And you see a sort of the classical architecture and so on. The temples are built in this style, which is considered, which becomes the norm in terms of the Western tradition. The pillar as the basis of the temple of the architecture. You see the galley ship. These were the commercial vessels. They were also the war vessels. This is the city of Athens, which, as I say, was the greatest of these cities. See the temples. Of course, it's idealized, and you realize that ordinary people were struggling and so on, but nevertheless, the achievements um, were considerable. Now, in contrast to um, Athens, which certainly is the greatest of these Greek cities, classical Greek cities, um, uh, in great contrast to Athens, um, there was a rival city state, um, which was south of Athens, south and west of Athens, in the area known as the Peloponnesus. The Peloponnesus, which is a peninsula that juts out from the south of Greece, from the south of the Greek mainland, the Peloponnesus. And there lay the city-state of Sparta, the city-state of Sparta. Now, the thing about Sparta was, in contrast to Athens, which had had this evolution from aristocracy, the military aristocracy of the 8th century, which controlled the peasants and also dominated war. Then you have the age of tyrants and finally democracy. Sparta never went through this evolution. No, there the aristocracy held on, and there was no evolution. Um, the lower classes were never able to challenge the upper class, the aristocrats. Um, the aristocrats continued to rule from 800 right down to 400 BC. And so this was an aristocratic state, a throwback, if you like, to the actual age of aristocracy back in the 8th century BC. The Spartans continued to base the Spartan elite, of which there were probably something like 30 or 40,000, controlled a large peasantry who they exploited. The peasants were known as helots. They were essentially tied to the land. They were not slaves sold in the marketplace. No, they had to stay in their little plot, and the landlords dominated over them. There was no evolution. And the characteristic of Sparta as a civilization, as a city-state, is that the Spartans were determined not to allow any evolution. They did not allow money, they did not allow merchants, they did not allow foreigners in their country. No, it's this exclusive group of 35 of 35 or 40,000 aristocrats wielding swords and spears who actually physically dominated over the helot population. And they, of course, the helots produced the food off of which the Spartan elite lived. This is the landlords basically got their surplus from this exploited peasantry. But these landlords, the Spartan elite, the aristocrats, had to spend a lot of their time just maintaining rule over its estimated 500,000 or 600,000 peasants that this group of 35,000, 40,000, essentially soldiers, aristocratic soldiers, tried to sit on top of and continue to exploit. This is so different from Athens. And indeed, in this part of the lecture, what I'm trying to do is to sort of illustrate, because it becomes important later on, the contrast between Athenian development and the evolution of Sparta. Because at the end of the day, these two states were going to clash one another. The two great alliances formed, one led by the Spartans and one led by the Athenians. And there was going to be a climactic war known as the Peloponnesian War, 431, see, it's to 404, which pitted Sparta and its allies and Athens and its allies in an all-out war, which ravaged the whole of Greece for 27 years and marks basically the end of Greek classical civilization. But before we get there, I want to develop this theme of the contrast between Athens and Sparta. Now, in order to preserve their rule in this way, a small minority of well-trained aristocratic soldiers over against 500,000 peasants, the Spartans developed a highly authoritarian and regimented society. This group, this class that dominated or had to be extremely well organized, extremely well trained militarily in order to maintain their rule. So while Athens moved to democracy, Sparta remained a highly rigid aristocratic society based on a very strong discipline. Now, in terms of the actual arrangements or rule, whereas we saw in Athens a popular assembly, the 40,000 citizens would be in the popular assembly. In Sparta, no, it was a group of about 5,000 Spartan, veteran Spartan soldiers who sat in an assembly, and this exclusive group made the key decisions. Of course, they had administrators and so on, known as ephors and so on. There were even people who were considered to be kings, but these kings had no real power except in time of war. They were military commanders at the time of war, but they had, when there was no war, they had no power. No, the real power in Sparta lay in this aristocratic assembly. As I've already remarked, there were no merchants, there was no money, there was no commercial life. This was strictly an agricultural society, and the Spartans did everything they could to prevent the development of a commercial society. Because with commercial society, you get merchants, you get artisans, you get foreigners, you get the corrupting influence of money, and the Spartans were against all of that. Now, in order to develop the personalities of people, a certain kind of education was necessary in order to produce these highly disciplined soldiers who could rule over such a large population. And so they had schools, but what did they teach? They taught, instead of mental exercises, the development of mental capacity, they taught physical education, military training, iron discipline, obedience, loyalty, conformity. As against the Athenian schools tried to develop students who were questioning, critical, indeed individualistic. The development of individual character was admired, individual personality. Of course, not in women, but in the male population. But the Spartans, no, they were contemptuous of the mental aspect of life. It was the physical prowess that counted: strength, discipline, obeying orders, loyalty to commanders. This is what they valued. And this went a step further, whereas, of course, in Athens, everybody had a home, wife and children and so on. There was individualism was taken for granted. In Sparta, no, the Spartans, the males and females, lived in dormitories, separate dormitories, and there were communal kitchens. The meals would be served in common. There were no really separate households. So in a certain sense, that the ruling class lived a kind of communal existence. And so what you have is so what you can see is that the Athenians and the Spartans, and they would insult one another in comparison their different ways of life, each of which considered themselves to be considered their way of life to be superior. The Athenians would say, we value individualism. The Spartans would say, no, group cohesion, loyalty to the group is what matters, not the individual. The Spartans would, the Athenians would say, rational thought is important. Thinking rationally is the highest mental function one can have. whereas the Spartans would extol the body, the physical strength of people. The Athenians cried up their democracy. We're democracy. They actually did this in their speeches, whereas the Spartans insisted that the best, that is to say, the aristocrats, knew best. Democracy meant rule by the mob. Furthermore, whereas the Athenians developed an attitude of welcoming foreigners into their midst, foreigners brought money into and new talent into the society. The Spartans were very suspicious of strangers. They excluded strangers. Anything strange, anything foreign was regarded with suspicion. And so ultimately, the attitude of the Athenians, we could say, was critical. It was critical, rational, whereas the Spartans were the ultimate conformists, we could say. So this is kind of basic contrast that exists in classical culture. Now, as time wore on,
Professor?
Yes. Hello?
I'm sorry, can you repeat what you said? Because, can you please repeat? Can you hear me?
You want to hear this contrast again?
Can you hear what I'm saying?
Okay, the Athenians were individualists.
Hello?
The Spartans valued
we just couldn't hear what you said.
What's that? Excuse me? What? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?
You're breaking up. No one can hear you right now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, just in and out, like you're cutting in and out. So you're gonna have to repeat the last 3 minutes, I would say.
Okay, what I was doing was I was developing this contrast between the Athenians and the Spartans to sort of sum up the differences between. The Athenians were democrats, the Spartans were aristocrats. The Athenians were rational, the Spartans were physical. The Athenians were individualists. The Spartans believed in the group loyalty. The Athenians were cosmopolitan. They welcomed strangers and wanted to know about other places. The Spartans rejected foreigners and didn't want to hear about different practices than their own. In the end, the Athenians were critical and rational. The Spartans were conformist. Did everybody sort of get that? Hello?
Yes.
You did get it?
Yeah, we got that.
Okay, good. So I'm making this contrast because coming back to that, it all ended in a war. And these two powers led these coalitions, these antagonistic coalitions over these principles. And of course, there were economic and political factors, which we will discuss in a few minutes. But so it's important to sort of understand this. Of course, I'm going to, this will appear on the review questions and I'll go over it again. Now, Sparta, as Athens grew stronger and stronger, Sparta and its friends became more and more alarmed. They felt that the Athenians, they wanted to dominate the whole Greek world. And they were right. Although the Athenians denied it, it's clear that given the way things are going, the Athenians might well have been able to sort of create an empire, and they took steps in that direction. And so the suspicions grew and grew until finally war broke out, as we'll see. However, before this happened, all of Greece, that is to say the Spartans and the Athenians, led all of Greece in a great war with the foreigner. Before the outbreak of this Peloponnesian War, there was something, this is at the beginning of the 5th century. You see the Peloponnesian War breaks out toward the end of the 5th century. At the beginning of the 5th century, a huge first war breaks out, the so-called Persian War, war against the Persian Empire. The Persian War, 490, this is a fantastic moment for all of Greece. And the Athenians and the Spartans lead the defense of Greece against Persia. The cause, as you know, starting in the late 6th century, from about 540 BC, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, Persia essentially conquered the whole of the Middle East. Persia, the modern Iraq, their army invaded Mesopotamia, it invaded Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, the whole shebang. Whereas up to this point, Egypt and Mesopotamia were separate entities and so on, and the states in between. The Persians, at this point, from 540 until about 530, they swept over the whole of the Middle East, and ultimately from Egypt through the Fertile Crescent, and including Mesopotamia and Persia, it became one entity. The Jews were small potatoes in this situation, as we've seen. Amongst their conquests, they took over modern Turkey, Anatolia to the north. That became essentially part of the Persian Empire. Now, in the western part of Turkey, along the coast, this area had been settled. Greek city-states were located all along the western coast of what is today Turkey, connected to the Greek mainland by water. It was all a kind of these galley ships connected the whole thing. Well, western coastal Turkey was part of the city-state system of the Greeks. Well, the Persians came and they subordinated these Greek city-states to the Persian Empire. These Greek city-states lost their independence, the ones that were now part of the Persian Empire, and moreover, commercial relations were interrupted between mainland Greece, including Athens, and the Persian Empire as they captured these lands. So there was anger in Greece. This was obviously a highly developed area of the Mediterranean economy, and the Greeks had no longer had economic access, privileged access to this now part of the Persian Empire. Well, this and other disputes finally led, in the first place, to the Persians crushing. This is at the beginning of the 6th century, of the 5th century. We're now in the 590s. Sorry, the 490s. Crushing the vestiges of the independence of these cities, and clashing with the Greeks, like the Athenians. A kind of skirmishes broke out. And finally, in 490, an all-out war, the Athenians and the Spartans called a great conclave of the Greek city-states, and they decided to go to war against the encroaching Persian Empire, because they felt that sooner or later the Persians, they had taken over the Western Greek city-states in Western Turkey, and they would move on mainland Greece. So a huge war breaks out between 490 and 480. And this is a moment of great glory for the Greeks. They have been fighting with one another for centuries and centuries and centuries. They have powerful, the Greeks have powerful navies. They have very good infantry. And when the Persians, annoyed, how dare the Greeks challenge our great empire, the Persians respond by sending two great waves of invasion, one in 490 and again in 480, in order to conquer mainland Greece, to take over Athens and so on. And there are a series of great land battles and sea battles. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the Greeks emerge victorious. And certainly the Spartans win great glory. For example, 300 Spartan soldiers, great warriors, stand off a Persian army of maybe 20 or 30,000 men all day. These 300 heroes win eternal glory because they die in battle. The Battle of Thermopylae is one of the famous battles. But the great victor in this whole thing are the Athenians, with their great navy and so on. They win a series of great naval battles, and the Persians are forced to retreat as a result. And this event, the Greeks consider it as great as the Iliad and the Iliad, the Trojan Wars, at the beginning of Greek society. This is a great event. It shows that the Greeks are best. They already are ethnocentric, and now their sense of pride, the greatness of Greeks, oh, the rest of the world are barbarians, has reached maximum, and becomes the background to the quarrel that breaks out between Sparta and Athens and leads to the tragic Peloponnesian War, as we'll see in the next lecture.